Hello, I'm Rachel Witchak-Sono, and I'm an applied linguist who works at York St John University in the UK. And today I'm going to be talking about native speakerism in higher education. What is it and how can we resist it? But first, I'm going to say something about the images that I've used in this presentation. They're all a bit random because all I did was in Google enter the search terms native speaker of English and select for Creative Commons images. So it's up to you to look at the images while I speak and maybe try to make a connection between the kind of things that I'm saying and the frankly quite random 18 images that pop up on the screen as we go along. So first, native speakerism. What is it? Well, ism is when there is some thinking and some practices attached to a word like native speaker that is quite commonly accepted. So native speakerism is thinking and practices attached to the word native speaker. Native speaker is a really popular phrase, and when I searched without the Creative Commons selection, I got images which were mainly attached to language schools, English language schools, people often accompanied by the background of a flag. The people in those pictures were often advertising these English language schools, and they often looked to me to be white, and the flags that were accompanying the photograph were often Union Jack or flags associated with English language speaking countries. So those images suggested that the thinking around the idea of native speaker is a really strong attachment between people and place, and the idea that the way you speak is determined by the place in which you were born and brought up. There are some English language schools that advertise as employing mainly or only native speaker English language teachers, and they hire teachers based on that policy. Usually a passport is evidence of so-called native speakerness. But my professional and scholarly association, which is BAL, the British Association of Applied Linguistics, has banned English language schools from advertising for native speaker teachers on its notice boards because there are just so many problems with that idea, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So from the perspective of applied linguistics, what are the problems with the concept of native speaker? Well, there are problems related to input, that's how and when we get a language, and also output, how do we measure competence or proficiency? And again, from the perspective of applied linguistics, there are not just problems with input and output, but the whole idea of what English or any named language is. And also problems for people who end up being discriminated against because they are considered so-called non-native speakers of English. So first, the input variables. Well, there are some relationships between where you were born or educated and the language that you speak, but the relationship is quite weak. Languages don't respect borders, they don't match passports, and lots of people are multilingual. So when it comes to the relationship between the language or languages that you speak and the place where you were born or educated, there are lots of intervening variables, and they include age, they include education, class, the task that you're involved in, and other aspects of your immediate context. And there are output variables too, so embedded in the idea of native speaker are concepts of competence and proficiency, with the idea that if you're a so-called native speaker, you are highly proficient in that language. But both competence and proficiency are very problematic too, because how do we decide what counts as proficient and in what situation, and who gets to judge, and how valid and generalisable are those judgments? So we talked about the input and output variables that are embedded in that concept of native speaker and how problematic and difficult they are to measure. The other problem is what gets counted as English, not as straightforward as it seems. The question of what English is an ontological one, and it involves thinking about political and social, economic questions, the answers to which have the opportunity both to advantage or disadvantage individuals and groups. So we know that these naming practices, such as native speaker or non-native speaker, are really important, and we're used to that idea when it comes to naming social classes or ethnic groups, but maybe less used to the idea of linguicism and disadvantaging people by labelling them as users or non-users of English. So as with all naming practices, we should be super careful how we use terms such as native speaker, and we should also be really careful to welcome linguistic diversity in all its many forms in UK higher education. Let's think positively about the cultural but also linguistic capital that our students bring in to our classrooms from around the regions of the UK and around the world, and design tasks and assessments that allow them to get credit for this capital.